Hey there, Jonathan Golko here. We're in the sound booth at Studio 1405. Welcome to Pro Tools 101. We're going to take a real quick look at the toolbar to find out the different functions that we can use to help navigate our recording and editing sessions. Let's dive in now. I've got a session that I've opened here, and as we can see, we have here on the left the mix window, here on the right the edit window. Down here, this is the transport. This is a copy of these functions here that allow us to play, stop, and record. We're going to go through all of these, but before we start, let's start by creating a MIDI instrument. In this case, we'll use the piano so that we have a piece of music to work with as we're going through all these functions. Right up here, we have track. If we go to New Track, this gives us the option to choose from mono to stereo, in this case stereo, audio track, aux inputs, master faders. In this case, we'll do instrument track. And we're going to change the name to piano. I'm going to hit Enter to create. Now, we also want a click track, a metronome, something to play along with that'll help keep us in time. Again, we go to track. Down here at the bottom is Create Click Track. I like to keep my click track all the way on the left so that no matter what we've got going on in the mix window, I know exactly where my click track is no matter where we are. I'm going to go ahead and turn this down a little bit because I know that in this studio, starting at its main default is a little bit too loud, so we can go ahead and drop that right away. Okay, so now we need to put a synth onto our MIDI keyboard. Here in multi-channel plugins, we have all of these options in terms of sound effects, but we want to go to Instrument to choose one of these synthesizers so that we can get our piano sound. We'll use MIDI Grand for today. Now, we're not going to go into the manipulation of the sound in terms of its model, room, dynamic response, and mix, so I'm just going to use its basic stock sound. This button here is the arm button. This arms to record. In this case, it gives our piano life. Okay, so we're going to record a 4-chord passage so that we can go through that top toolbar and identify some of their functions based on how it reacts to MIDI information. So first, I'm going to go here next to the 120 beats per minute, and I'm going to pull this red diamond over to reveal 1 bar before the official measure 1. I like to do this so I get a nice clean recording right before measure 1, and I'm going to use this function down here called Preroll so that we're going to get 4 clicks prior to our recording. This is important so that if there's any time leading into the beat, we don't want that to be cut off. So I've started 1 beat before measure 1 with a pre-roll of 4 beats, which will give us a total of 5 right before that recording starts. We got the click track on. Let's give this a go. Okay, so now let's start here at this top toolbar and go from left to right and run down real quick what all of these functions do in their most basic formality. If we were to hold Option or Alt on a Mac keyboard and zoom in by scrolling in, you can see that we can change and zoom in to look at our region. That's what this piece is. Now, if we go to Shuffle, Slip, Spot, and Grid, these options allow us to manipulate this information in terms of movements. So, for example, we're in grid right now. That's the default. As you can see, we can only select on these grid lines, and they are broken up into 4s based on the 4 quarter notes in one measure. We could change this to 1/8 notes. You can see that the grid populates to fill individual 1/8 note spots within a single bar. That can get as complex as 64th notes. Let's keep it at quarters. If we go to slip, that keeps the grid, but allows us to move this region as well as highlight without being locked into the grid itself. That's mostly useful if we're going to be trying to isolate a single passage to get rid of without being locked into the grid of it and then complicating our ability to highlight. Shuffle will be useful. For example, let's go back to grid, and let's say we like bar 1 and 2, but we want to get rid of bar 3 and 4, but we want 5 to take the place of 3. Let's go to Shuffle and hit Delete. Notice that that part of the region simply slides over or shuffles over, and it resumes exactly where this one cut off. I'm going to hit Command-Z to undo that action. So we have our full progression here. Spot is going to be more useful if you're doing something like film score or sound design in a video game, let's say, where you need to pinpoint an exact sound effect at a certain time within the time code. You can do that to the symbol bar and put some drop point in that way, or you can go to the literal minute and second and have that sound effect hit exactly. So if the director says, I need an explosion at 35 seconds and 4 milliseconds, you can just pinpoint that right in without having to eyeball it and figure it out. For most of what we're doing, we're going to live in grid or slip. Moving on to the right, we have audio and MIDI zooming. This is memory zoom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see that it's just zooming in and out from where our marker is set. Again, the shortcut here is going to be Option-Alt on your Mac keyboard, zooming in or out, scrolling up or down. This magnifying glass is the same thing. It's a zoomer tool, but Option-Alt key, get in the game. Okay, these next three tools, plus this overarching bar. This is a smart tool. This allows us to use these three tools at the same time, simultaneously, depending on where we click on our region. So we've got the hand tool here at the bottom. This gives us the ability to move it around. We got the selector tool if you're here up top. If we go to the end, we have the trim tool that allows us to cut off the beginning or the end of our part. Now, if we right-click on that, we have options, standard, TCE, or loop. Standard, as you can see, just adjusts the ability to crop, essentially, the beginning and end of your region. TCE is time compression expansion. That's going to be more useful when we get into samples, like taking a drum loop and making it conform to a certain BPM that we have set that's different from what it was recorded in. As we can see here, if I shorten this by pulling it in towards the left, all of the information gets scrunched together. Command-Z to undo that, and if we try to extend it by pulling it to the right, you can see that all of that information stretches. In this case, we're going to leave it as it is, but it's a very cool function. Loop gives us the ability to pull this to the right, and as you can see, it's taking the exact same information and literally just looping it. That might be useful if you're doing something like a hi-hat or a drum loop that's perfectly set for what you need, and you're just going to pull it across for a certain duration. In this case, I'm leaving it as it is. The hand tool has a few options as well, time, separation, and object. For simplicity today, we're just going to stick with time because that's our ability to just simply grab and move our region. This is a scrub tool. If we were to click and move to the right and move to the left, that allows you to listen to your sound form, whether that's the MIDI information or a sound wave, and be able to cycle through and listen to just that microscopic aspect of it. Here we have the drawing tool, the pencil tool. This has several options as well: freehand, line, triangle, square, random, parabolic, and S-curve. We'll get more into this when it comes into manipulating the actual MIDI information. If we were to double-click this region, for example, we get here to the piano roll. This is the MIDI editor. These notes correspond to the keyboard here. Down here, we have the options like velocity, sustain, audio volume. In this example, if we were to take the pencil tool, stick on line, so it's going to be straight lines, and we were to just simply make automation points, which means that when we do this in playback, it's going to mirror these actions. In this particular case, audio volume. Let's take a listen without the metronome. And we should hear the volume starting high, getting softer, and rising again. Now, of course, in this case, this isn't very natural, but if you were to have an entire orchestra playing and you just wanted your second violins to come down a little bit and match in the crescendo because for one reason they were missing that within the MIDI information, this would be a good tool to help add a little bit of that dynamics in the post-production. Now, if I hit the escape key on the keyboard, you'll see that it cycles through these options. I'm going back to the Smart tool, which gives the ability to just highlight and delete those. Again, that was the use of this pencil tool. Otherwise, you can draw in notes using that to get new MIDI information. And the parabolic and S-curve is going to be more useful if you're going to be dealing with certain dynamics such as fade-ins and fade-outs. If we move on to the right, we now get into the time code. By clicking this drop-down, we can see we have options like bars and beats, minutes, seconds, time code, feet, frames, samples. We're mostly going to live in bars and beats here in the studio, where we're just trying to find each individual measure and beat so that we can do our editing in the time code as it exists musically. We could go to minutes and seconds if in the podcast you're just more concerned with where your time frame is in terms of seconds and minutes. Let's put this back to bars and beats. Next to that, we have the start, end, and length. This populates as we highlight throughout our region. As we can see, I've highlighted bar 1, beat 2 to bar 4, beat 3 for a total length of 3 bars and 1 beat. These are, of course, just points of reference. Next to that, we have this play MIDI notes when editing. If we click back into our MIDI editor, the piano roll, and we highlight, we can hear these notes. That's because this function is selected. If we shut it off, we don't hear these notes. That benefit may be if you're working on a drum part, hi-hat, bass drum, and you don't necessarily need to be hearing it, you're just trying to clean up some of its quantization where the note falls within the beat. That's going to be more useful if you don't need to hear it. Otherwise, it's just going to cause ear fatigue by hearing the same noise pounding over and over again. But in the case of a piano part, we may want to be able to hear that so we know where that part was going. Moving on, we got the grid and nudge. This again, if we unclick, is going to get rid of those grid lines, and it's just going to be a free form. We'll keep that selected so that we can subdivide what we're working on. Nudge gives us the ability to adjust by time or by note how we move this form. If we only wanted to deal with milliseconds, for say we had a vocal cue that just needed to be 100 milliseconds earlier, we could change this based on its time and nudge to be able to adjust a small increment based on seconds rather than bars. And now we get into the play functions here. This little clock, if we click, we'll see down here it says waiting for sync. This is going to be useful for using an MPC 4000, some kind of drum machine where it's another piece of hardware that has the same play, stop, record functions on it. This allows the system to sync to that other master hardware. In this case with the computer, we don't need to use that. We're going to shut it off. If for some reason that's on and it's messing with your recording, go ahead and restart Pro Tools, close the session, reboot it, and it usually shuts it off. Kind of a little bug that happens from time to time. Next, pretty self-explanatory, we have the stop, play, and record functions. Down here we have return to 0. We'll notice that when we click that, our marker went back to the beginning of the session. Opposite end. This is going to send it to the end of the session. Oh, this looks like a few bars after wherever we finished recording. If we hit back, it's only going to do 1 bar at a time or 1 bar forward. You can also go back between 1 and 2 on the keyboard to do the same motions. Hotkeys are particularly useful, so you don't have to move the mouse around so much, and you can just keep your hands closer to where all the action is without having to do extra motions. Now let's look at the transport down here. Again, it's a mirror image of some of this stuff we've got right here. But let's take a look at some of these other options. We've got pre-roll and post-roll. This gives us a pre-roll prior to the recording as we saw in this. The post-roll effectively does the same, but on the back end. So if we are looking at just a certain highlighted spot, but didn't necessarily need it to loop or end, we could do the post-roll and it'll just play through for however many bars we set it. A fade-in is used with just a few milliseconds to basically fade into the track without it having any sort of pops, clicks, sound artifacts that might disrupt right before going into a punch-in, for example. But in this case, it's not too big a deal. We're going to keep that off. Now, we've got some new functions here, and let's take a look at those. If I turn the pre-roll off, we got the count off. It's the same thing as pre-roll, except for we're going to have a few clicks prior to the record actually starting. Let's take a listen to what happens if we do a count off with 2 bars. We turn our click back on. I'm going to hit record. We should hear 8 clicks and then see the recording begin. I like to use pre-roll. And then at this point, no matter where you are in the song, you'll get that 1 bar before the part that you're really listening for. We have the ability to change the meter and the tempo, which we can also do here if we double click. If we were to say we want to change something down here, we like this first part at 4/4 at 120 beats per minute, but we want to make some changes here. We'd hold Control on the Mac keyboard to get that plus sign, click. We want to stay in 4/4 because that's where our chord progression lives. And add a new beat per minute here, and let's go ahead and up that to 140 beats per minute. You notice that the entire MIDI information just squished together to conform to this new time code. Let's take a listen. So we can manipulate the time code in terms of its beats per minute and its meter right up here. I'm going to go ahead and undo that by holding Option, which gives us the minus in front of it, and click to remove. Those functions can be achieved down here. I like to do them manually here by using Control and Add. Right down here we have a few final functions to go through. Wait for note. You'd basically use your MIDI keyboard as a play starter. Next to that we have Metronome. This is an on-off function, muting, unmuting, for the actual click over here. So if we let this go, and we'll turn it back on. Off. We could essentially do that here with the mute button, but say your mix window has 20, 30 tracks on it, it's populated, and you don't know where your click track is. Using it on the transport is going to make this much easier to be able to turn that click on and off and not slow you down in your workflow. Next to that, we have Midi Merge. This is really useful if we're going to be adding MIDI information where there is some missing. Let's go ahead and do one more passage where I'm going to first play the first and third chord and then punch in the second and fourth. Okay, so we see that we've got the first and third chord here, but we want to make sure we can punch in for the second and fourth chord. So I'm going to begin right here in the beginning. We're going to have a little bit of a pre-roll to get us through that bar, and then because we are on Midi Merge, we'll just be adding to the track without over-recording it. 3 to record. Now, if we were to Command W, close that window, select this whole region, and turn off Midi Merge, now when we record, it's going to completely record over what we just did. Just like that. I like to keep Midi Merge on, so if I want to go back to a piece of music and say, well, I like this and that, but okay, this part was pretty sloppy, so let's go ahead and delete that, I can literally punch right back into that one spot. Midi Merge, very useful. Command W to close that window. Conductor track. We notice that this says manual tempo at 120 when unselected. When we select it, it puts it back to our normal default function. in this default function, conductor track, again, control to be able to add tempo within anywhere in the track. We unselected, we cannot add to that part. So let's go ahead and leave that, just in case you wanted to change your music throughout the piece to give it a little bit more of a human dynamic flow. We can really get into the depths of it by doing this drop down, going back to our pencil tool, and let's go ahead and freehand draw a tempo change. We begin at the 120 beats per minute. We're going to get really slow and then ramp back up towards the end. As you can see, all this MIDI information is manipulating each individual movement in the time from 120 down to a slower tempo and then back up. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. A very cool function, and it allows you to take your MIDI information that could just be very static and in time and give it a little bit more of that orchestral, musical theater kind of feel in terms of stretching time and playing with emotions. Not always useful depending on what your genre and what you're looking for, but in this case, it's a very cool feature to have. Okay, that concludes this segment of this program. Next time, we'll look at adding a live instrument and digging into some of the plugins. Those are the sound effects. Compression, EQ, reverb, delay, to mix something that we've done here with a MIDI piano and add it with a live instrument in such a way that enhances the performance and gives us an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into Pro Tools. Until next time, I've been Jonathan. Keep creating.